The new Gordie Howe Bridge is scheduled to open in just over a week after Canada made a new agreement with a disgruntled United States. Today, Prime Minister Mark Carney tried to offer some clarity on what the U.S. is getting from the bridge that Canada alone paid to build.
It's not splitting the tolls of the bridge. It is an agreement for 15 years to split net revenues. Splitting of tolls, any sharing of the toll revenue won't happen until all of the debt is repaid. For the first few years, net revenues will be modest. In fact, we expect them to be negative, as traffic ramps up. When the splitting begins, all of the portions that go to the U.S. government will be reinvested in economic development, regional economic development.
Okay, so 50% in net revenues in the initial years, but what is that in dollar figures? Well, that remains unclear. Meanwhile, we're learning that Canada's other concessions to the United States may not have made any difference. Here is U.S. Trade Representative Jamieson Greer speaking yesterday.
We just haven't seen a lot of movement. There are a couple things that Canadians have done. They had a digital services tax they proposed, then rolled back. They had an online streaming act where they wanted to force American companies to fund Canadian companies that they rolled back. I'm glad they did that, but they don't really get credit for doing something bad and then undoing it, right? That's just good practice on their part.
All right, it's good practice on our part to go to the power panel. We've got Michelle Cadario, who is Deputy Chief of Staff to former Prime Minister Paul Martin. Andrew Thompson is a former NDP cabinet minister in Saskatchewan. And Peter MacKay is here. He is a former federal Conservative cabinet minister. Michelle, this continued string of gives to the U.S. because of the leverage that they're exerting on the bridge and other things, to hear that from Jamieson Greer that you don't get credit for that because you made a big mistake that you never should have made and we're not going to give you credit for undoing it. Well, what does that tell us about where things are in this relationship and these talks?
Well, everything's difficult. That's hardly the most thoughtful of a response, but seriously, everything is difficult with him, not just for Canada, but for everybody in the entire world. I would separate out the bridge from some of the trade irritants and other issues. I think that part of it is just posturing, to be quite honest. They're never going to say, yep, they've done everything that we want, and so we're going to have a big give. First of all, I don't think that Jamieson Greer is empowered to be able to actually say that, right? I think he is conceded, and I think we all know only one person, Donald Trump, is going to sign a deal for the U.S., and it's going to be at the timing of his choosing when he wants to do it. And if it's satisfactory to Canada, then Mark Carney's going to sign on. So, I think that in the interim, I think Jamieson Greer is doing his job, trying to position the U.S. as the strong and mighty, and that Canada has to kind of come to its knees and keep giving in. But I don't think Mark Carney's biting, and I don't think Mark Carney's bit all along. And I think that, I think that in the end, they are confident in their approach. I think that there's been some glimmers of hope and perhaps some conversations on the side. And, I'm actually a little bit more optimistic now than I was a month ago.
Yeah, I mean, that could be a very granular improvement in this sort of thing.
Don't test my scale.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, exactly. On a scale of 1 to 10,
That's right.
-3. But, Peter, on this, yes, the bridge is kind of separate and apart from the broader trade negotiations. It wasn't one of the irritants. It kind of became a target of opportunity to exert leverage, which is what it is. Just what do you make of what we're seeing there, that we're reassured the concession on the bridge is minimal, if not nothing, but with no math to back it up, while digital services tax and other things don't seem to have won any goodwill south of the border.
Yeah, and that's why I don't think you can separate it out, David, in my opinion. And what's biting is tariffs on steel and on aluminum and cars. So that cumulative effect is starting to, really impact our economy. And it's also impacting, by the way, the trade deficit, which is something that the Americans have been concerned about for some time. I think the issues around the bridge are still, frankly, somewhat confusing. I've been trying to sort through this today and figure out what exactly it means. Operating deficits, 15 years, when it's paid for. Well, how do we know when it'll be paid for? What it boils down to is that Canadian taxpayers laid out $6.4 billion, and we're going to be splitting revenue at some point. for an asset that Canadians own, presumably. I mean, all of this translates to, ironically, elbows down on Mr. Elbows Bridge. Like, I'm quite surprised, actually, that this has played out the way it has. And let's look back at the bigger picture here in terms of where we are in these negotiations. The Mexicans, we've talked about this before, many have, seem to be in a much better place in terms of their negotiations. I can't quite grasp some of the moves, including the recent hiring of Hillary Clinton's staffer. Maybe that's not a big deal in the grand scheme of things. We know somebody in the White House takes these things very personally and how he feels about Mrs. Clinton. So I don't quite get the strategy or the plan as it's being rolled out. We're not in a good place. We're certainly further away from where we were when Mr. Carney took office in terms of his guarantees that he would get a deal and he could handle Trump.
Okay, I want to get to Andrew first. Just a couple of things to fill in for the audience at home. The hiring decision Peter referenced there is a senior official, political staffer in the Prime Minister's office, an American who worked with the Democrats, now Chief Operating Officer, and I believe maybe Deputy Chief of Staff in the Prime Minister's office. Where we are, Andrew, I think, on the bridge is there's two deals at play here. The Carney deal and the Harper deal is how I'll simplify it, right? So the Carney deal is for 15 years sharing 50% of either net revenue or profit after you deduct a certain amount of expenses and sharing it 50-50 with the United States. But in like the first 5-6 years, as you're seeding the infrastructure, as they say, there may not be any profits or there may not be anything to share. And then the Harper deal is the original deal that when it's all paid off and Canada's costs are recovered, you split the tolls 50-50 with the state of Michigan. So that is what the Prime Minister's talking about there. We got an idea of how that will work. It's a little bit murky on the other stuff. And maybe, Andrew, I don't know, they don't want to be more specific until the bridge is actually open. And they don't start putting things into the ecosystem that could just antagonize south of the border. Just to fill that in for the audience. Anyway, Andrew, your thoughts on where we are on this?
Well, I think that is, a helpful way to look at it. I mean, the original deal signed by Harper was a bizarre deal that we would front all the costs on this bridge with the assumption that somehow we were going to get paid back over time. Not normally the way you would do a binational infrastructure project like that. Not to say that the bridge, I think we all recognize here in Southern Ontario how important that link is in terms of maintaining supply chains, in terms of expanding our economic opportunities. But it was an odd deal to strike to start with. All that said, it hasn't made any better by the looks of it in terms of what's been recently negotiated, except for the fact that it is closer to getting opened. And if that is the end game for what Canada wants and needs, then I'm assuming that the Prime Minister is working on that. I am surprised, to be honest, that again on this is the second or third time the Prime Minister has been put on his back foot by the Americans on this, whether it's been on opening dates, whether it's been on the language around the deal. And the fact that he continues to front this rather than actually put up an official who can say with some certainty and authority, this is what's actually in the deal. I don't understand the strategy, the political strategy on wanting to wear this. It just doesn't look like it is finished. And the fact the Prime Minister had to back down on what he had said only a week ago about how this was structured, or maybe we were all too dense to understand what he was laying out, is problematic because it causes people to scratch their head and go, I don't really know what the Prime Minister's up to. And that is, I think, politically more problematic than whatever lays in the deal itself.
Yeah, it's a deal negotiated by Dominic LeBlanc and Mark Wiseman, explained by the Prime Minister, but technically Gregor Robertson, the Minister of Housing and Infrastructure, is the minister responsible for it, and I've been hassling everybody for clarity, and we have not gotten it. Michelle, I'll give you the last word on this, because I know you wanted to respond to the elbows comment, but just to explain some of the motivation, Lisa Raitt was on the show the other day, and she said she spoke to people connected with the bridge, and for every 6 months it stayed closed, it delays it getting to break even and payback by a full year. So the 1-to-2 ratio is a rough one there.
Exactly. Like, it is in our interest very much, as we did front this, as Prime Minister Harper put that money up, to get this thing open so that there is some sort of revenue and some sort of income coming back to pay back taxpayers. And so, anyone can say that there was a better deal to be had and that, but, really, was there? And when I think when the problems of the Strait of Hormuz, we get kind of sidelined and sideswiped and let's just attack Canada on whatever issue might be at the top of the desk. So, I think that I have no doubt that the Prime Minister is being very pragmatic on this and looking for being able to get some kind of return and the best return that we can. And getting this open, and I think, as Andrew said, the free flow of goods and just the benefits to the economy are going to be more than paying for the bridge.
Well, look, the Prime Minister did announce another big deal today, this with dollar amounts and specifics, because the Prime Minister announced a big defence purchase, $2 billion to buy 190 made-in-Canada armoured vehicles. And the Prime Minister says it's just another piece of a bigger plan to grow the economy.
There's a common thread to what we're doing, is we're focusing on what we can control, not waiting for decisions out of Washington, but moving forward with Canadian solutions with other export partners that help create those good long-term jobs for the people of London and beyond.
But also this week, the Prime Minister is facing some resistance to his economic plan. First Nations leaders gathered here in Ottawa are voicing their concerns over major projects and going too fast. And next week, the Prime Minister sits down with the premiers. They want to talk about some of their priorities, like more healthcare money from the federal government as they deal with surging deficits. So, Peter, federalism is healing. The premiers are meeting with the Prime Minister, wanting to talk about transfer payments. You are seeing now, as the Trump threat sort of gets baked in as background noise, a push on some of these things, First Nations and premiers. What do you think the Prime Minister might face with that shift?
Imagine that, premiers happy with the current situation. Look, I think the surging deficits is the operative phrase here that provinces and territories and the federal government should be concerned about. And that impacts on all of those other looming issues, including affordability and taxation. So I'm not surprised in a way. I am pleased, as you know, having spent some time at the Department of National Defense. General Dynamics, the Canadian government has been doing business with them for a long time. They make a good product, also for export. So that fits in nicely with the Prime Minister's plans, and it's certainly good for our economy, and it's a good product that Canadian forces need and desire. But it's not surprising to me either to see that the provinces are pointing to and rattling the cage a bit on needing more money for healthcare, for their infrastructure, which is also crumbling in some situations and some concerns. And you're going to see, I think, more demands around infrastructure as well. I was just in your home province of Newfoundland and Labrador, and of course they have a lot of concerns around their ports. Obviously getting more energy into the broader market and settling the issues around Lower Churchill Falls. So there will be a lot of demands put forward at that federal provincial meeting. It will be interesting to watch how the Prime Minister is going to handle that. And, when it comes to plans, the plan to get back to balance is something that I've never heard discussed in the last number of years. And that should be of concern to everyone.
Yeah, Andrew, it's interesting. In the first year or so of Prime Minister Carney's time, the premiers were quite content to just have sort of the agenda defined and shaped by the Prime Minister's office. They're getting regular meetings and getting read in. And now, as I understand it, there's a back and forth going on about the meeting next week that right now the agenda the federal government has is all about the economy, and the provinces really want to put healthcare and their structural financial situations on the agenda. So we'll see where that goes.
This is a perennial question about which level of government has is best positioned to help support the services that Canadians are expecting. To be honest, I'm not sure to what extent, if we really looked at it, the provinces have done anything more than just pass on the increases that have been provided by the federal government into the healthcare system. It's unclear as to what exactly they have been adding on top of that on their own. And certainly there's a lot of pressures, and it's not one that hasn't been identified. I look here in Ontario, we're now, at least 8 years in, if not more, into a government that promised to end all-way medicine, and certainly a long way away from that, from them being able to keep that Conservative campaign promise. Now, they've been adding money in, but certainly the federal government has been providing them with more money to add in. It's unclear as to exactly what the provinces themselves are doing, especially the big ones, to actually step up and take on some of that. That's not to say there hasn't been infrastructure builds. That's not to say that there hasn't been a renewal of healthcare infrastructure, but the overall personnel costs are continuing to see stress. And we see that in provinces, including British Columbia, where there's pressure right now from the nurses.
Yeah.
We're seeing that here in Ontario, where the wait times continue to be a concern. And we're seeing that really across the country. So it's not surprising that the provinces are looking for someone to share the pain with on this. But it's unclear what the provinces have actually brought to the table to help resolve this problem themselves.
Well, Michelle, there's another interesting trend at the provincial level. Like, their deficits are all sky high, record high in a lot of cases. But using the example of here in Ontario, a lot of fiscal capacity has been sort of vacated, right? Free license plates, for example, renewals. Like, that's money that could go into the health system. And they're looking to the federal government to sort of offset that, while the federal government's pot committing to defense and industrial build-outs and Arctic sovereignty that is going to eat up more and more and more of what they have capacity to deliver on.
Well, I think that I would separate it out a little bit again. The healthcare spending, it's a year over year. You're committing for long term, right? And that the growth has been slowed in terms of how much the federal government has been putting in. And you're right, it's been off the agenda for the last couple of years, with Trump kind of taking over and the economic concerns going. I think that partly the premiers are probably sitting back and thinking, yeah, the Prime Minister's going to talk to us on all our economic issues. He's going to want to get the ports open and to get supply routes open and invest in infrastructure. But let's open the door on this. We haven't heard the Prime Minister really talk about healthcare in a big way or in any way.
Just AI innovation in healthcare at the AI strategy announcement was like one of the big times he did it, right?
Well, but we have to absolutely, and you have to start looking at, to Andrew's point, again, like, if we're not looking at doing things differently, then we are just going to keep facing skyrocketing costs. Population's getting bigger in some of these provinces. It's getting a lot older, and so cost per person is going up. There's always been issues between the provinces about just how you actually fund it, what the formula is. Is it on a per capita basis? Is it kind of rationalized by demographic or not? And those issues remain. And the provinces, which is the interesting part, don't necessarily agree with each other. No. And so, the art of this is, are they going to, when you're on the federal side, are they going to stick together and come together with one ask? Or are they going to be able to split apart? And then, you kind of start making the side deals. And then it kind of starts to be easier to deal with the Confederation as it is.
We might see a bit more of a united front based on what the finance minister showed us yesterday in Prince Edward Island, because we spoke to Peter Bethlenfalvy and Eric Girard, and the health transfers were going up by 5% a year. Now they're set to go up by just 3% a year, and they say their costs are going up by 8% a year. So they want that gap bridged in some capacity. So we'll see next week in Charlottetown, where we're going to be taking the show. Okay, we're out of time for this edition. Got to say goodbye. Peter MacKay, Andrew Thompson, Michelle Cadario. Always appreciate it.